Folks, thanks for joining us again. And for the new viewers that keep coming in and adding to our numbers, we appreciate that a lot as you get to be familiar with the Stockwell Day-to-Day News show. And wow, you want to stick with us today. The things that we are talking about are world-changing, as well as some stuff that's going to hit you in your local municipalities. So whether we're talking about nuclear stuff happening in Taiwan, or nuclear stuff happening on the music scene, stay tuned here. Let's go to the first story. Very significant development that's taking place in Canada, where a recent ruling at the Supreme Court of British Columbia has granted ownership status effectively, or at least dual ownership status, to a huge chunk of the large city of Richmond, British Columbia, granted status to a collection of First Nations tribes or groups. They're called the Cowichan Alliance. And what this ruling has done, it has said that about 730 acres of the city of Richmond, British Columbia, is going to have to deal with the fact that the courts say that the First Nations group have a land claim on all of that urbanized area, and at the very least, it's going to mean for dual ownership. This is what some people are saying. This is dramatic. It's historic. Nothing seen like this, quite like this before in Canada, and maybe even around the world. Now, some people think that when it gets to the Supreme Court of Canada itself, the ruling will be struck down. But that is a coin toss. There's no guarantee of that. And a very significant development here. Before this show will air again tomorrow, there will have been a town hall meeting, and that'll be tonight in the city of Richmond, proposed, being called by the mayor and saying this is a very significant stuff and landowners need to show up. So if you want to see some pretty animated action, you want to tune into the news tonight for that. But the longer term on this, if it's not overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada, going to be very significant. That's not all that's happening in Canada. U.S. investment in Canada's oil and gas companies continues to go up. As now, there's a number of different reasons for this. First of all, one of the things that we're seeing some trend change in is when polling is done in Canada and the U.S. and to a smaller degree in Europe, there is being more of a, let's say, a calmer view being taken by the population in general relative to what we call climate change, or the severe climate alarmists who have been telling us for years that the world will be coming to an end very shortly if we don't shut off all oil, gas, and anything else that emits energy. And there's some reasons that is changing. That when we're looking and following these polls, first of all, there's more and more scientific evidence coming out that used to be called just conspiratorial or not scientific, but in fact, it's very sound scientific evidence that's suggesting maybe the science isn't so-called settled. Of course, we always have to be concerned about emissions and the environment, but more and more studies showing it isn't as significant as people thought. There are ways actually that are being used to be ameliorating to that. And we're also looking around, and because we've been told for 30 or 40 years, but every 10 years somebody comes out and says within 10 years, for instance, the oceans will be overflowing this city. They're not. There's no evidence that the cities of the world that are coastal are being swamped by melting oceans. The Arctic melting away before our eyes, in fact, is not happening, as we see from global data, which is increasingly made available now by sophisticated high altitude camera work. We can see that some of the Arctic ice line and the borders of that are shifting, in fact, and moving to the center where the Arctic ice is becoming far thicker than it was around the edges, but in fact is not depleting. So all kinds of other evidence is forthcoming that's making people just sit back and take a look. The other thing that's happening that people should be aware of in terms of this increased investment coming into Canada, that it was last year where it looked like the leader of the official opposition in Canada, a position which I held at one time, Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, was making the case very well on some of the environmental concerns. And as people saw, and at that time, a year ago, it looked like the Conservatives were going to sweep with a majority because there was a very unpopular prime minister in Canada at the time, Justin Trudeau, and also these various different studies showing that, in fact, maybe we have the climate issue more under control than we thought. But a lot of factors were showing that the Conservatives were going to sweep in the election. That was a year ago, but of course then the Trump factor kicked in. Also, the Justin Trudeau factor was gone. The Liberals punted him out because they were dropping so precipitously in the polls. That is when, though, when the polls were showing very high for the federal Conservatives, it was investments, and some coming from the U.S., a lot from the U.S., into Canada's oil and gas sector that started moving upwards. And honestly, it's still moving upwards. And, you know, we're told to give some credit where credit is due. To his credit, Prime Minister Carney has been saying that he wants Canada to be an energy superpower. Now, we're going to see if that actually turns out, if his policies follow that, because he is still very much beholden to what we call the severe left rump of the Liberal Party. It's not totally different than what we're seeing in the United States with the Democrat Party continuing to lose popularity in the polls overall because they are beholden to their extreme leftist wing. The Democrats haven't figured out how they can get away from that. That plagues the Liberals, the federal Liberals in Canada, to a degree, not quite as much. But Prime Minister Carney, if he is seen as bowing down to the extremists, whether it's on the environmental side or on other issues, then they're going to continue to run into some problem at the polls. At the polls themselves, we see that the two parties are almost neck and neck again. So the Conservatives have come back up since the last election, running neck and neck. What mainstream media is doing, the culturally Marxist media, then they feel that the only thing they can do is to viciously attack Pierre Poilievre and point out to him that among older voters, he's losing, or he's behind the Prime Minister Carney. But what they don't like to point out is he continues to gain among those who are in the younger voting cohort. They're liking what he's saying. They like what he's saying about, you know, getting back to the days where maybe young people could actually afford to buy a house and do things that were affordable and have a job that's going to last and not be taxed to death. Those messages are getting through to the 35 and under cohort. What needs to shift, and it's just starting to shift now, to the so-called older ones, I guess I'm part of that cohort, is realizing that leftist or heavily socialist economic policies, many of which are being embraced by the federal Liberals, actually result in an erosion of strength in the economy and actually put things like people's seniors' retirements at risk. They erode the buying power that people who are on fixed incomes, especially retirement incomes, have. And that's going to start to be noticed by the older voters. They're going to, I think you're going to see gradually the older voters starting to listen more to their kids and grandkids about things like being able to flourish economically, and you're going to see a shift that way, is what I believe. Now, the federal Liberals are masters at stating one thing from a high-minded philosophical point of view, but when they see the polls shifting, they kind of say, well, if you don't like, you know, those principles, we've got another set of principles. And we saw that just last week with what is seen as an astounding turnaround from the federal Liberals and Prime Minister Carney on issues related to safety. And politicians know, especially related to the female vote, that safety issues are a real concern. And what we've seen there is that the proposals for crime reduction for serious, repeat, violent crime, that Pierre Poilievre and the federal Conservatives have been talking about bail reform, for instance. For months, they've been pounding on that. The Conservatives have the fact that serious repeat offenders who have multiple offenses, when they get caught, there's a brief hearing and they're right back out on the street again, and that we need bail reform so that this very small percentage in our communities who are committing the very large percentage of the crimes are kept in jail longer. Some even maybe will get the benefit of being able to then withdraw from some of the things they are addicted to. But that has been gaining so much in popularity that Prime Minister Carney shocked the far left wing of his Liberal Party by announcing he's bringing in legislation to deal with, guess what? Wait for it. Yes, bail reform. I met with a group of police officers this weekend. I said to them, if there's one thing you'd like to see changed that you think would make our streets safer, keep citizens safe, and to keep you men and women as first responders safe, what would it be? And it unanimously, they said bail reform. They pointed out how in this one community of about 300,000 people where I was visiting and speaking, they said, believe it or not, there's about a dozen people who are committing over 50% of the crime like breaking and entering, crimes like assault. And if we could keep the serious, repeat, violent offenders in jail, crime would drop and the streets would be safer. So federal Liberals doing what they do best, seeing something that people want, and looks like they're going to be giving it to them. Fascinating developments on that particular end. So as we move from there, we see some interesting developments related to Canada internationally. And here, as Canada is being heralded now more and more as a valuable source of clean, refined energy, we have countries like India saying that Canada is unreliable. And as they look to Canada and they look to the federal Liberal government, and they want to be able to import more refined energy products from Canada, like liquid natural gas, which would go a long way to helping India with their terrible emissions problem, because they burn so much coal and they have massive plants that burn dung, going from massive plants to in millions of homes across that country where they actually use dried dung to cook and heat their homes. And here Canada has a great resource of refined product, which would result in a lowering of emissions in India and therefore globally. But the leftists, the severe climatologists, are screaming in Canada at the federal Liberals saying, don't let this happen. So an unfortunate position here that Canada is being seen by what could really be a major allied country, India, as being unreliable. What we need to look at in terms of what's been successful, there has recently been the final conclusion of the construction of a pipeline called Trans Mountain. This particular pipeline was started by a company called Kinder Morgan way back in 2012. And as soon as they announced that they were going for the permitting and doing all the environmental studies, they were so besieged for years with excessive demands, unrealistic groups that were stopping it, that after incurring billions of dollars in cost, it actually collapsed. The proposal collapsed. It had to be picked up and purchased by the federal government, since they were responsible for the sorting out of all these regulations. The federal government at that time, and this would be about 2018, bought that pipeline project, which wasn't completed yet, for $4.5 billion, and within the next 2 or 3 years had incurred $34 billion worth of costs just related to ongoing regulatory and land claim issues. Now that that has been completed and flowing, the oil flowing is going all the way to the coast of British Columbia, not far, actually, the tanker route is not far from the city of Richmond, which could also pose some interesting situations if, in fact, those land rulings are being upheld. but it's increased by 600,000 barrels a day. The amount of liquid natural gas and oil that's being able to flow out of Canada to countries desperately in need, as far away as Australia. Certainly a lot of it goes to the US for their refining purposes, but it just shows what can be done and the potential that is there with almost immeasurable reserves of energy, mainly coming from the province of Alberta, other provinces too, but mainly from Alberta. And so we see this real opportunity for GDP growth in Canada, as well as the lowering of emissions if these energy products are handled and produced and refined properly, as they are in Canada. So tremendous development there on the recent opening of the Trans Mountain pipeline, and the promise of more to come if we can get reasonable heads around the table and then bring other countries, assist other countries in lowering their particular needs and getting away from the dirty fuels that they're burning now. Not long ago, something went sort of unnoticed in mainstream media, as often happens. Just a few months ago, in the country of Taiwan, there was a referendum, and the referendum had to do with should they begin to reopen the nuclear facilities that they had closed, especially about 15 years ago, in the light of the earthquake and the tsunami that hit Japan and affected a nuclear plant there. By the way, the overall effects of that on that particular nuclear plant in Japan were extremely minimal and nowhere near the disaster that was reported. But anyway, it came to, they have a law in Taiwan that says if you're going to reopen, the government wants to reopen a nuclear facility, it has to get approval, it has to be passed in a referendum. And what was reported was the referendum was lost, and mainstream media, certainly in North America and around the world, said the people of Taiwan do not want nuclear, and they voted it down. In fact, what wasn't largely reported, the referendum, the number of people who voted, there's 20 million registered voters in Taiwan. Okay, so just watch the math on this. There's 20 million registered voters. But as with many referendums, a significant, it wasn't even a majority that voted. So 1.5 million people voted no, we don't want to see nuclear power and these nuclear power plants opened again. 1.5 said no, 1.5 million. 4.5 million said yes, we want the plants to open. So why didn't they open? Because the law on their referendum legislation says that there has to be a certain percentage of the 20 million who are registered voters. Didn't matter, not 20 million voters, but just registered. Most didn't vote. And so because they didn't get the necessary percentage of registered voters, even though the vote to open the nuclear plants was hugely popular and won significantly, they now have to wait 2 more years before they can take the vote again. So you might think, well, what's the issue with that? Well, the issue with that is China is increasingly rattling the sword or rattling the saber, as we say, in terms of a possible blockade of Taiwan to weaken Taiwan economically and make the people of Taiwan more open to, as they call it, joining again with communist China. What would happen if there was a blockade? The power that's generated in Taiwan right now, the largest portion of it comes, in fact, from liquid natural gas, LNG, and some oil products. Only about 13% of that particular country runs on so-called renewables like solar and wind, which will never be enough to power a country like Taiwan. And the estimate is if Taiwan was ever blockaded so that tankers would not go through, Taiwan's liquid natural gas and oil supplies would run out in about 12 days. That is, in my mind and in the mind of many people, a horrific possibility that people just don't want to see. And it's part of the reason they want to restore their safer, cleaner, modernized nuclear facilities. Again, another potential customer for Canada, the city or the country of Taiwan, getting clean, long-term supply of liquid natural gas the pressure is on in the right direction. We'll see if the left extreme climate groups are going to hold sway. Keep in mind that those groups, the extreme groups on the left, are always supported by the culturally Marxist mainstream media. People in media generally are supportive of these extreme left views, and they're not highly tolerant of other opinions. That's why it is a political problem and makes many politicians nervous. Now, along this line of countries being able to block other countries, China has recently put very significant blocks on the movement of rare earth products, minerals that are used significantly for the AI generation we need, for semiconductor chips, and very significantly for defense system, missile defense, and others. You may not be aware, the fact is China produces 60% of the rare earth minerals, but more than that, over 90% of the processing of those minerals comes from China. Believe it or not, the United States over the years has developed a dependency on China for these rare earth minerals, which are used very significantly in the defense system and defense industry. And now China has kind of shocked the world by putting export controls on those materials. If they're able to do that and maintain that hold, that gives them the opportunity in the months and years ahead to really move ahead in terms of development of products and processes that need these rare earth minerals. It would give them a significant catch up in defense systems, in the space race, in the semiconductor development, in AI development. China would be in a hugely advantageous position. And that's the reason that the US has imposed 100% tariffs on many Chinese products. It's the only way they can retaliate. The US can retaliate is by saying, well, you're just not going to be able to sell any of your products then into the US unless you drop these export controls over rare earth minerals. So keep your eyes on that. The U.S. imports 70% of all of its dependency on rare earth minerals from China. A possible positive, somewhat offbeat, but important consideration here is these rare earth minerals can be found in other countries in the world. China has always been very plentiful, especially in terms of the production of those minerals. This could move other countries like Canada, who has also a good storage of these minerals deep in the ground. It could lead to the development, the processing, the mining of these in other jurisdictions, which would be positive in a way because it would take away from China's stranglehold on this. We'll see what happens and see what the effect of that is. On the culture front, I don't know how many of you would know the name Jessica Sanchez. She's actually an amazing singer and just recently won the America Got Talent contest. If you ever watch that, it's kind of interesting to watch. She won. Now, you're going to say, okay, what's the big deal about that? Well, first of all, it was a very heartfelt story because she was a runner-up over 10 years ago in the American Idol contest as a young girl, young woman. And now, as she is approaching her 30s, this is a big comeback story. She comes back to win the America Got Talent contest. But the other thing that's interesting from a cultural point of view here is at the time of her winning this just recently, it was obvious and clear to everybody that Jessica Sanchez was very, very pregnant and in fact, very, very married. And she's just announced the birth of her child, 6 pounds, 12 ounces for anybody who's interested. This is we're watching an interesting, is it a change of attitude, a change of thought? Because things like for young women, getting married and certainly having children have appeared to have fallen out of favor somewhat over the last 30, 40 years, but maybe making a bit of a comeback. And not the least of which we've seen with our friend, I use that term, Taylor Swift announcing she's getting married, and the effect that that's going to be having on this ongoing effect culturally for women and young women, that, hey, maybe it is okay to get married. Maybe it is okay to have children. Let's watch and see if this particular trend continues. And congratulations to Jessica Sanchez and her husband on the announcement of the birth of their child. And still in the music scene, I'm sure if you're within even 50 years of my age, you may not have heard of the group called 17. Now, some of you will remember, especially the women, the magazine 17, which was huge back in the day, and I think still has some currency. That's not what we're talking about here. This is a Korean pop group. It's called K-pop. If you haven't been following over the last several years, K-pop has been sweeping the planet. And they are making their first appearance ever. They're in Austin, Texas. They're doing a world tour. The event is sold out. These high-energy K-pop group. And what's interesting about this is parents seem to like the message that this K-pop group has. It's a seems to be a very positive message. They don't get into some of the darker themes about drug use and hypersexuality. They talk about youth friendship. They talk about perseverance. They even talk a little bit about family as they're doing their concerts. So again, very interesting that when you have parents, shifting their view a bit and saying to their kids, hey, you can go and see that particular group, it does signal something of a shift, because there's been a concern among parents, among moms, about their young daughters flooding to the Taylor Swift concerts. And even though Tay has announced she's getting married, of course, a lot of concern about the lyrics on her latest album, among which included, and I hope there's no youngsters listening, but spreading her thighs for a man who is not her husband. So those kind of messages, a lot of moms have some concern with, as they should. And so you get a group like the group 17, K-pop, coming on the scene. Is this a signal of a bit of a shift in the under 30 and under 35 population? Let's wait and see. Thanks for joining us. Talk to you tomorrow.